I never planned to share these stories because even now, I'm not sure what I experienced was real. No ghosts, no exaggeration, just things that happened exactly the way I remember them. And the last one, is the reason I don't sleep with the lights off anymore. Let's start with the least disturbing one, though at the time, it didn't feel that way. So I want to start this off by saying that I am not someone who scares easily. I grew up in a pretty rough neighborhood, and I've had my fair share of uncomfortable situations over the years. So when I tell you that what happened to me on this trip genuinely shook me to my core, I need you to understand that this is not something I say lightly. This is something that still crosses my mind more than I would like to admit, and I've debated for a long time whether or not I even wanted to share it publicly. But here we are. A little over 2 years ago, I had a conference to attend, about 4 hours from where I live. The company I work for usually books hotels for these kinds of trips, but for whatever reason, the hotel we normally use was completely sold out. My coworker suggested we try Airbnb, since neither of us had ever used it before. At first, I was a little hesitant because I'm old-fashioned and I like knowing what I'm walking into. But the options looked nice, and honestly, it was going to save the company some money, so I figured why not. We found a house that was listed by a woman who seemed very friendly and responsive. The house was on the outskirts of a small town, and it was surrounded by a lot of open land. Looking at the photos, it looked peaceful and quiet. That actually appealed to me because, after a full day of conference stuff, the last thing I want is to be in a noisy hotel with a bunch of strangers slamming doors all night. We arrived on a Thursday evening around 7 o'clock. The house was exactly what it looked like in the photos. Nice little property with a gravel driveway, a big front porch, and open fields on either side of it. My coworker Dave and I grabbed our bags and headed inside. The place was clean and well decorated, and the host had left a little welcome basket on the counter with some snacks and a handwritten note. First impressions were good. We ordered some food, watched some TV, and turned in early because we had an early start the next morning. The conference ran the entire next day. It was a long one. We didn't get back to the house until almost 9 that night. Dave wanted to go over some notes from the day, but I was completely drained and just wanted to shower and go to sleep. We talked for maybe 20 minutes and then called it a night. I remember feeling really good about how comfortable the house was as I was falling asleep. That feeling didn't last very long. Somewhere around 2 in the morning, I woke up to what I can only describe as footsteps on the gravel outside. Now I know that sounds like nothing. Could have been an animal, could have been anything. But the sound was pretty deliberate and it was close to the house. I laid there for a few minutes just listening and it stopped. So I told myself it was nothing and tried to fall back asleep. I want to be transparent here and say that I'm not someone who hears something go bump in the night and immediately panics. I really did believe it was nothing. I closed my eyes and eventually I drifted back off. The next morning, Dave and I had a few hours before we needed to head back to the conference for a half-day session. We made some coffee and sat out on the front porch, and that's when I noticed something that made my stomach drop a little. The welcome mat in front of the door had been moved. It was now flipped upside down and pushed off to the side of the porch. I mentioned it to Dave and he kind of shrugged it off and said, "Maybe the wind moved it." I didn't push it because honestly, I didn't want to be the dramatic one. But I knew in the back of my mind that a heavy rubber mat doesn't just flip itself over from wind. We went to the conference, wrapped things up by early afternoon, and decided to stop and grab some food on the way back since it was our last night. We picked up some beers and some takeout and got back to the house around 4. It was still light out and the property looked completely normal. Nothing out of place this time as far as I could see. We ate, had a few drinks, and Dave went to bed around 10 because he wanted to get an early start for the drive home. I stayed up a little later just watching something on my laptop. It was around 11:30 when I finally decided to get up and lock the front door before going to bed. I had assumed Dave locked it before he turned in, but when I went to check it, the door was unlocked. Again, not a massive deal on its own. Dave probably just forgot. I locked it, double-checked it, and went to bed. What happened next is something I've replayed in my head probably 1,000 times. I woke up at some point in the middle of the night and I genuinely couldn't tell you why. There was no noise that I could identify. I just opened my eyes and I was wide awake. And then after a few seconds of lying there, I saw it. There was a shadow passing slowly across the gap at the bottom of my bedroom door. It was subtle, but it was there. Something was moving in the hallway. My entire body went cold. I didn't move, and I didn't make a sound. I just watched. The shadow stopped right outside my door and just stayed there. I'm telling you, I have never in my adult life experienced fear like that. Everything in me wanted to scream, but I couldn't make a single sound. I grabbed my phone off the nightstand and I texted Dave. I told him to lock his door right now and not to come out. The shadow was still there. I don't know how long it stood outside that door. It felt like an eternity. Then it moved again, slowly back toward the direction of the front of the house. I called 911 as quietly as I possibly could. I whispered the address to the dispatcher and told her I thought someone was inside the house. She told me to stay in the room and keep the door locked and that someone was on the way. Dave texted me back and said his door was locked and he was calling the police too. I sat with my back against the wall next to the bed, with my phone in one hand and a lamp I had pulled off the nightstand in the other. I know a lamp is not exactly a weapon, but it was all I had, and I was not going to just sit there and do nothing if that door came open. I heard the front door open and close at one point. A few minutes later, I saw lights through the window and heard the police pull into the driveway. When they came to my door and identified themselves, I have never been so relieved to hear anything in my entire life. They cleared the house and came back to tell me and Dave that no one was inside. But here is the part that still gives me chills to this day. One of the officers found the sliding window in the kitchen slightly open, and on the kitchen counter there was a glass that had not been there when we went to bed, just sitting there, a single glass. One of the officers also found a small piece of torn fabric on the edge of the back fence that separates the property from the open field behind it, like someone had climbed over it quickly and caught their clothing on the way. We did not sleep for the rest of that night. We threw our bags in the car before the sun came up, and we drove the entire 4 hours home without stopping. The host was contacted by the police, and she was completely horrified and said she had no idea how anyone could have gotten in. The keypad on the front door was the only way in, and she swore the code had only been shared with us. I don't know who was in that house that night or what they wanted. The police couldn't tell us much because there wasn't a whole lot to go on. What I do know is that someone was in there. The glass, the fabric, the shadow under the door. None of that was in my imagination. I've stayed in hotels every single time since then, and I don't see that changing anytime soon. I think about that shadow under the door all the time. Whatever was on the other side of it, I'm just grateful it stayed there. I've gone back and forth about whether or not I should tell this story, not because I'm embarrassed or anything like that, more because I know how it sounds and I know what people are going to think when they hear it. I'm a pretty rational guy. I don't believe in much that I can't see or explain. So when I tell you that I have no explanation for what happened to me, I need you to understand that's not something I say lightly. I'm in my mid-30s now. This happened when I was around 19 or 20. Old enough to know better than to let my imagination run wild, but young enough to still be doing stupid things I had no business doing. There was a house in my town that everybody knew about. I grew up hearing about it the same way you grow up hearing about anything in a small town, through whispers and half stories and older kids who swore they knew someone who had been inside. The house had been empty for as long as anyone could remember. It sat at the end of a dead-end street, and it was the kind of place that even during the day looked wrong. I don't know how else to describe it. Like the light never quite hit it the same way it hit everything else around it. Every town has a place like this. Ours just happened to be this house. The stories about it range from the believable to the completely out there. Some people said a family had died inside under circumstances that were never fully explained. Others said that people who went inside came back different. Not dramatically different like in a movie, just off, like something had shifted in them that they couldn't put into words. I always chalked all of that up to the kind of mythology that builds up around any place with a dark history. People love a good story, and they love even more to be the one telling it. My friend Danny was the one who finally got us to go. He had been pushing for it for a while, and the rest of us had been dragging our feet for the usual reasons. We didn't want to get in trouble. We didn't know enough about the layout of the place. We weren't sure if anyone still kept an eye on the property. Eventually, Danny just wore us down the way he always did. He had that personality where he just kept coming at you until you ran out of reasons to say no. So one night in late October, the four of us drove out there. Me, Danny, my friend Marcus, and a guy we knew named Pete, who none of us were particularly close with, but who had a truck with a decent amount of cargo space in the back, in case we needed to make a fast exit. That probably tells you everything you need to know about how seriously we were taking this. We parked about a quarter mile down the road and walked the rest of the way. The neighborhood around the house was quiet in that specific way that feels intentional, like the silence is doing something. There were no lights on in the surrounding houses, even though it wasn't that late. We got to the property and stood at the edge of the yard for probably a full 2 minutes just looking at the place. Danny was the first one to move. He walked straight up to the front door like he owned it, and the rest of us followed, because what else were you going to do at that point? The front door was unlocked, which immediately felt strange to me. Not broken open, not hanging off the hinges, just unlocked, like someone had been expecting company. Inside, it smelled the way you'd expect. Dust and something damp underneath it, and something else underneath that, which I couldn't identify then and still can't now. We had flashlights and we spread out a little. Marcus and Pete stayed near the front of the house, and Danny and I went further back toward what looked like it used to be a dining room. I want to be clear that up until this point, I was not scared. Uncomfortable, sure, a little on edge, but not scared. That changed in the dining room. In the center of the room was a table with 4 chairs around it. On the table were 4 plates, not dusty or broken. 4 clean plates arranged like someone had just set them out for dinner. I pointed it out to Danny, and he got quiet for the first time all night. We stood there looking at those plates, and neither of us said anything for probably 30 seconds. Then from somewhere above us came a sound. It was rhythmic, slow, and even like footsteps. But it wasn't the random creaking of an old house settling. It had a pace to it. Someone walking from one end of a room to the other, and then back again, over and over. Danny looked at me, and I looked at Danny, and without a word, we both backed out of that dining room. We called Marcus and Pete over and told them what we heard. Pete wanted to leave right then. Marcus wanted to go upstairs and look. Danny was somewhere in between. I told them we should at least figure out what we were dealing with before we made any decisions. That was the most rational thing I'd said all night, and I'm not sure I believed it myself when I said it. We went to the base of the stairs and stood there listening. The footsteps were still going, back and forth, steady. Danny called out asking if anyone was up there. The footsteps stopped. Complete silence. We waited. Nothing happened for about a minute, and then they started again. Same pace, same rhythm. Like whatever was up there had just been waiting for us to stop talking. Marcus started up the stairs, and I followed him mostly because I didn't want to be left at the bottom alone. The stairs groaned under us, but the sound from above kept going undisturbed. When we got to the top of the stairs, there was a hallway with 3 doors. 2 were open, and one at the far end was shut. The footstep sound was clearly coming from behind the closed door. Marcus walked toward it, and I stayed close behind him. He put his hand on the door handle and looked back at me. I nodded even though I absolutely did not want to nod. He pushed the door open. The room was empty. No furniture, no person, nothing on the floor except a thick layer of dust that had clearly not been disturbed in a very long time. But the sound kept going. We were standing in the doorway of an empty room, and the sound of footsteps continued like someone was pacing back and forth right in front of us. Marcus stepped inside and swept his flashlight across every corner of the room. Nothing. The sound stopped the moment his foot crossed the threshold, and it did not start again. We stood in that room for a few minutes and then went back downstairs and told Danny and Pete. Pete had already made his way back outside before we even finished the story. We didn't push back on that, we left. Nobody said much on the walk back to the truck. On the drive home, Danny made a few jokes, and I laughed at them, but my heart wasn't really in it. Something about that room bothered me in a way I couldn't shake for weeks afterward. The thing that gets me when I look back on it isn't the sound itself. Sounds can be explained. Old houses do strange things. I know that. What gets me is the dust on that floor. If whatever we heard had been pacing back and forth in that room for any length of time, the dust would have shown it. There would have been a path worn into it. Some kind of evidence that something physical had been moving through that space. There was nothing. The dust was completely undisturbed, a perfectly even layer across the entire floor, like nobody and nothing had been in that room in years. I've told this story a handful of times over the years. Most people land where I expected them to land. They come up with a reasonable explanation and feel good about it. I don't blame them for that. I probably would have done the same thing if I hadn't been standing in that doorway myself. Marcus and I still talk about it occasionally. Neither of us has ever come up with anything that fully accounts for what we heard or what we didn't see in that room. And I think at a certain point, you just have to be okay with not having the answer. Some things just don't resolve cleanly. That night is one of them. I want to be upfront with you before I start. The things I did during this period of my life are not things I am proud of. I have spent a long time thinking about whether or not to share this, and I decided that maybe someone out there needs to hear it. Maybe there is someone doing something similar right now who needs a reason to stop. So I will tell you what happened, and I will not sugarcoat any of it. About 12 years ago, I was going through what I can only describe as the lowest point in my entire life. I had recently lost my job, I was barely keeping up with rent, and I had completely isolated myself from anyone who cared about me. I was not in a good place mentally, and looking back, I think that is the only explanation I have for why I started doing what I did. I want to be very clear that I am not using any of that as an excuse. I know what I did was wrong. I knew it then too. I just did not care enough at the time to stop myself. It started small like most bad habits do. I would go for drives late at night when I could not sleep, which was most nights. I live in a mid-sized city, and there are these older residential neighborhoods on the outskirts of town. Big older houses set back from the road with long driveways and mature trees. Very quiet, very dark. I started noticing which houses had lights on late and which ones were completely dark. I started noticing patterns. Which houses had dogs, which ones had security lights, which ones seemed to have nobody home for long stretches. I told myself at first that I was just observing, that I was just paying attention. But we all know where paying attention like that leads. I broke into my first house on a Wednesday night in late October. The house had been dark for 3 nights in a row, no cars in the driveway, no mail being collected. I convinced myself the owners were traveling. I went around the back and found a basement window that was not latched. I slid it open and lowered myself inside. I walked through that house for almost 20 minutes. I did not take anything that first time. I just walked through the rooms and looked at how other people lived. I remember standing in their kitchen and opening the refrigerator just to see what was inside. I cannot explain why I did that, except that I was inside someone else's life, and I wanted to feel every part of it. After that first time, I kept going back. Not to the same house, but to different ones. I got better at reading which houses were safe to enter. I started keeping a mental map of certain streets and certain blocks. I knew which nights to go and which to avoid. I was methodical about it in a way that scares me to think about now. For a stretch of about 8 months, I was entering homes multiple times a week. I never took anything valuable. I would move something small, a book from one table to another, a chair turned slightly in a different direction. I thought of it as leaving a trace without leaving a trace. I thought it was clever. I was not clever. I was disturbed. There was one night that changed everything. I had scoped out a house in a neighborhood I had not visited before. The house sat at the end of a cul-de-sac surrounded by old oak trees. I had driven past it several times over 2 weeks and it always looked empty. No activity, no lights, no cars. I went around the side of the house and found a back door that gave way without much resistance. I stepped inside into the kitchen. Something felt different immediately. The air inside was warm. Most empty houses feel cool and stale. This one did not. I should have left right then. I did not. I moved slowly through the kitchen and into the hallway that connected to the living room. There was just enough moonlight coming through the front windows to see the basic shapes of the furniture. I stood at the entrance to the living room, and that is when I heard it. Breathing. Slow, steady breathing coming from the couch. There was a person lying on that couch in the dark. I froze completely. I could not move. I could not think. I just stood there like an absolute idiot while my body refused to cooperate. The breathing continued for a few seconds and then it stopped. There was a pause that felt like it lasted an entire year. Then a voice in the dark asked, "Who was there?" I ran. I cannot tell you exactly what happened in the next 30 seconds because my brain was not recording information in any useful way. I remember the back door. I remember the cold air. I remember running across the backyard and not looking back. I got to my car, which was parked 2 streets over, and I sat there shaking for a long time. I expected to hear sirens. I expected lights to come on across the neighborhood. Nothing happened. The street stayed quiet. Eventually, I drove home. I did not sleep that night. I lay in bed running through every scenario I could imagine. Someone had been home. Someone had heard me, had spoken to me, had heard me run. That person was either still lying on their couch trying to rationalize what just happened, or they had called the police and given a description. Every set of headlights that passed my window made my stomach drop. Every sound outside made me sit up straight. By morning, I was completely wrecked. Nothing happened over the next few days. No knock on my door, no phone call, nothing. But something had shifted in me that I could not undo. I kept thinking about that voice in the dark. That person woke up in their own home in the middle of the night and found a stranger standing in their hallway. The fear they must have felt, the violation of that. I had been so wrapped up in my own strange compulsion that I had never fully let myself sit with what I was doing to other people. That night forced me to sit with it, whether I wanted to or not. About a week later, I came home from the grocery store to find my own front door slightly ajar. I was certain I had locked it when I left. I stood on my front step for a long time before I went inside. Everything looked normal. Nothing appeared to be moved or missing. But on my kitchen counter, there was a single item that was not mine. It was a small, ordinary rock. Just a rock sitting on my counter. There was no note, no other sign of anything unusual. Just a rock that did not belong to me sitting in the middle of my counter. I stood there looking at that rock for probably 5 minutes. I picked it up and turned it over in my hand. It was just a rock, but it did not feel like just a rock. It felt like a message. It felt like someone saying, "I know what you do. I know how to get inside. I know where you live." I set the rock down and I called a locksmith that afternoon and had every lock in my house changed. I checked every window, every door, every possible point of entry. I did not sleep well for weeks. Every time I heard a sound at night, I was convinced someone was inside. I never found out who left that rock. I never found any other signs that someone had been inside. Maybe it was a strange coincidence. Maybe a neighbor came in to borrow something and forgot to mention it. Maybe it was exactly what it felt like. I have no way of knowing. What I do know is that I never broke into another house after that night. The combination of that voice in the dark and that rock on my counter was enough to end something in me that should have never started. I have spent a long time since then trying to understand what I was looking for during those months. I think I was trying to feel something real at a time when my own life felt completely hollow. I was living vicariously through other people in the most invasive way imaginable. I cannot fix what I did. I cannot undo the fear I caused people who probably still lock their doors twice and check their windows before bed. What I can do is tell this story honestly and hope that someone somewhere hears it and makes a different choice than I did.